to look at the reaction of the Jewish leaders in the book of Luke, in all the Gospels. You hear, and I have read of people that did not believe, that would say, hey, if I could see a miracle, if I could see God perform a miracle, I would believe. And I don't believe that. I doubt that. If you don't have the mind and the heart to receive these things, it's not going to convince you. If you saw a miracle, you would immediately try to alibi it. Did I really see what I see? Did I really experience what I experienced? It all has to do with the receptivity of the individual. And here you have the Jewish leaders, the priests, the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. Many of them were in the synagogues when these miracles of healing were done. They were aware of the news that had been spread about him, of the great works that Christ had done, and they didn't believe it. They saw what was going on, and they didn't believe it. We'll see here in a few minutes where Jesus was arrested and one of his disciples cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest, and he reached up and healed it. And they didn't believe. My point is, when people become so fixed in their comfort zone, they have the good life, they don't want to be disturbed, there is very, very little to jar them out of it. It takes some type of traumatic event in their life to bring them out of it. They do not come to faith all that easily, even though they were to see the things that were happening during Christ's time. We have been looking from the very beginning primarily at the things that Jesus taught. We noticed that he taught in a different way from the way we learn things today in the Western world. We're a fact-based society. When we go to the university or to high school or anything, we're taught facts. At least it was that way when I was there. I don't know what it is today, but we're taught facts. To the Middle Eastern world, they told stories. They painted word pictures. They had symbology and allegory and all of these different ways of presenting information. And sometimes that can be very challenging for us today because we like facts. To the Jewish people particularly, facts that did not pertain directly to their lives didn't matter that much to them. They didn't value them the way we do. I may never use chemistry in anything I do, but it would be interesting to me to know a few facts about chemistry. Not so with them. It was those stories, those things that pertain to their daily life, that could change them, that could teach them lessons from the stories. So, as I said, it can be a little challenging of us to review these writings all the way through the Bible, except maybe in the prophets sometimes where it's very specific what is being said. But even there are allegories and there are stories that in the teaching. So we spent a lot of time looking at the parables of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the things that he felt was important. And these are not only universal, but they're eternal. They're just as true for us today as they were in the days when Jesus was on earth and was teaching them. I want to go back for just a moment and look at a story he told to the people. And this was right after his authority was challenged in chapter 20. They asked him, by what authority you do this? And he said, I'll ask you a question. The preaching of John the Baptist, was it from God or was it from men? And they reasoned among themselves, if we say from God, he'll say, why didn't you believe it? If we say from men, we fear the people, they'll stone us because they consider him to be a great prophet. Shortly after that, he told them a story that cut to the very being of these religious leaders. And the story was of a nobleman or a very wealthy man who had a piece of property, and he planted a vineyard and a garden in it. And he turned it over to some tenants. And he went to a far country for a good period of time, a long time, enough for the crops to come up and start bearing fruit, trees bearing fruit. And the analogy was that Jesus, or that God, had chosen the children of Israel, and he had essentially planted a vineyard for them, and he had turned it over to them. And this man, when time came for the harvest, he sent his servants to gather his crops, his part of it. And the tenants beat him up, threw him out of the vineyard. That's exactly what happened to God's prophets who were sent here on earth to do his will and to convey his will to the people. He sent other servants to get his goods, and they beat them up. And finally he said, I know what I'll do. I will send my son. They will have respect for him. But when they saw him coming, they said, this is the heir. This is the heir. If we kill him, then we can inherit the vineyard. There's not a one-to-one correlation here to the story of God sending Jesus, but that is the message that Jesus has conveyed. God has now sent his own son, and the people want to kill him. The crowd responded, may this never be so. Surely this could never happen. Then Jesus looked directly at these people and he said, then what is the meaning which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, but he on whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken the parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. It's amazing to me, and I've said this before, but it's still amazing to me that these people live this experience with the Son of God among them in their synagogues, healing and preaching. And yet they didn't believe. They wanted to kill him. Another point I'd like to make again is they wanted to accuse him, they wanted to distance him from the affections of the people because they had the good life. They were the religious leaders. They were supported in the community. They had the good life. But when he claimed to be the Son of God, and a little later on during the trial, you'll see him make that direct claim to them. When he claimed to be the Son of God, not only did they want to diminish his influence among the people, but at this point, he had blasphemed in their minds and they wanted to kill him. Jesus is going through Jerusalem. You remember the triumphal entry where he was riding on the back of a donkey colt that had never been ridden on before. And the people, the disciples who had seen all these miracles began to praise God, and they got caught up in this, and they began to say, praises to him who comes in the name of the Lord, and they were directing all of this at Jesus, And the inference is they realized that this was the Son of God, that this was a great thing that was happening. The religious leaders asked Jesus at that time, you restrain your disciples. This was offensive to them. And Jesus said, if these people are quiet, the stones on the way will cry out. And so the people continued to be with him and follow him as he went into Jerusalem. We remember that when he was in Jerusalem, he was in the temple courts daily teaching the people. That was where the temple guards were. That's where the religious leaders were. Some of them there, the chief priest would be there performing their services, and there he was amongst them, teaching the people. In the evening, he would retreat to the Mount of Olives, and there he would spend the night. And the next morning, when he got back to the temple, the crowds were there ready for him to teach them. We remember that as the Passover was approaching, and we're in chapter 21 now, that he sent his disciples ahead to prepare for him to eat with them for the very last time, the Passover. His days on this earth are numbered. There has got to be a conflict or a tension going on here. He knows what's ahead of him. This is a member of the Godhead. This is the member of the Trinity who has lived a sinless life. Before he came to this earth, God could not tolerate sin. And that's what separated him from man. And yet he knew that in a few days he would take upon himself all of the sin of the world. And his Father would not look at him because of the separation of God and sin. And that's why on the cross he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because he took sin upon himself. This was a tension that was going on within him. He realized the wonderful thing that was going to come about because he did this. He was going to redeem mankind. He was going to reconcile humanity back to God. So that was a glorious thing. He would then go back to his Father, and he would be crowned with glory and honor and be given all authority on heaven and earth. So there is a tension going on here in Christ over what's going to happen the next few days. The chief priest, the teachers of the law, as I said earlier, were looking for a way to arrest him and to bring him to trial and to dispose of him. They wanted him out of the way. One of the few times, maybe the only time, that the Bible says that Satan entered into someone, it says that Satan entered into Judas Iscariot. And he went to the chief priest and planned with them a way to betray Christ. Now, why did Christ need to be betrayed? He was in the temple, but the people didn't know where he was when he was away from the people. The religious leaders who wanted to arrest him didn't know where he went or where he was when he left the public ministry. Judas knew. And after the Passover, Jesus went out into the Garden of Gethsemane. And there he was with his disciples. And there's when that moment where he went away about a stone's throw from them to pray to God. And he counseled them, you need to be praying with me that you do not fall into temptation. He knew what was coming. And he prayed that if this cup, if this suffering and this taking on of the sins of the world could possibly be taken away from him so he wouldn't have to do it, that this happened. And yet he said, not what I want, but what you want. Your will be done. Came back and his disciples were asleep. Luke says they were exhausted from sorrow. He had predicted this several times, and they really didn't understand it. But now it was coming home to them what was going to take place. About that time, Judas came with a group of the temple guards and the religious officials from the temple. And he came up to Jesus and was going to kiss him because this was a signal that this is the one you need to arrest. But before he got to do that, Jesus said, Judas, are you going to betray the Son of Man with a kiss? The disciples, seeing what was happening, said, Lord, should we strike with a sword? And one of them, as I said earlier, cut off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Now, he wasn't aiming at the ear. This was to get the head. Jesus healed it, and he said, enough of this, away with this. And he asked the people, why have you come to me with swords and clubs? Am I leading a rebellion? I was among you in the temple every day, and you had access to me. But he said, no, this is your hour. This is darkness. This is your hour. And so they arrested him, and they led him away. They carried him to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. Let me back up just a little bit. Before he was arrested, he was talking to Peter, and he said, Peter, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. It's reminiscent of the devil petitioning God about Job. And authority was given to Satan to test Job. On this occasion, Satan had asked to sift Peter, one of the more dynamic of the apostles. But Christ said, I prayed for you. I prayed for you. And when you have turned back, strengthen the brethren. You know, he had a lot of confidence in Peter. Peter said, Lord, I am willing to go to prison with you. I am willing to die with you. And Jesus told him, Peter, before the rooster crows in the morning, you're going to deny me, knowing me 3 times. So they carried Jesus into the courtyard of the house of the high priest. There were 2 priests at that time, Caiaphas and Annas. Annas was the one the Jews recognized as having the lineage going back to the tribe of Levi and all the way back to Aaron's family. But apparently he had fallen out of good standing with the Roman government. They had appointed their own priest that was close to the government. And he was not the one the Jews recognized as a high priest. And this was Caiaphas. But he was the one in charge because the Roman government supported him. So they're in the courtyard. It's cool. And they build a fire, and the people gather around that fire to warm themselves. And a little servant girl comes up to Peter and says, you're one of them. Peter says, I'm not. I don't know the man. A few minutes later, a person comes up to him and said, you were with them. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man. About an hour later, another one came up and said, you're a Galilean. Surely you're one of them. And again, Peter denied knowing Christ. And the rooster crowed. And Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. And Luke says, Peter went out and wept bitterly because he remembered the words of Christ, that he would be denied by Peter 3 times before that rooster crowed. This had to be a horrible moment for Peter, because he was a person of great faith. He was a person who had been with Jesus, who had spoken up many times in the discussion. And this had to be a horrible moment for him. When morning came, they took Jesus in before the chief priest, before the council and the teachers of the law, and they asked him. This was his first trial before them. If you're the Christ, they said, tell us. If you're the Messiah, tell us. Jesus said, if I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I ask you, you will not answer me. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. And this had to shake the people, because essentially he was claiming to be God. He was claiming to be God. And then they asked him, are you then the Son of God? And Jesus replied, you are right in saying I am. At that point, they said, what do we need to hear anymore? We have heard the blasphemy from him with our own ears. Then the whole assembly got up, and they carried him to Pilate. And they began to make accusations against him, saying he has subverted our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be a Christ, a king. That was a falsehood. You remember when they challenged him about paying taxes to Caesar? He said, give me a denarius. And he said, whose picture is on this? Whose inscription is on this coin? And they said, well, it's Caesar's. He said, well, you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. You give to God what belongs to God. False witnesses, false accusations. Then Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, yes, it's as you say. Then Pilate announced to the chief priest, I've examined this man and I find no charge or no wrong or no charge substantiated in him. And he wanted to let him go. But they resisted, and they began again to say, he stirs up the people in all Judea by his teaching, and he's now come down from Galilee and doing the same thing here. On asking this, Pilate, the governor, asked him, are you a Galilean? And he realized that this was under the jurisdiction of Herod. And so he sent him off to Herod to be examined or tried. Now you remember back a few chapters, Herod had wanted to see him because of all of the things that he had heard about him. The people were saying, this is John the Baptist who has come back. This is one of the great prophets. And Herod says, I killed John the Baptist. I know what happened to him. Who is this person? And he wanted to see Jesus out of curiosity. Well, he got his chance when Pilate sent Jesus to him. Herod asked him a lot of questions, but Luke says he didn't answer him. He didn't respond to him. Now, this is the king of a section of the country there, one of the 3 divisions of Judea. Well, it covered more really than Judea. And he refused to answer him. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were in the court, and they were vehemently accusing him of all kinds of things. And Herod would question him, and he would not answer. So Herod and his guards around him began to mock Jesus. They put a robe on him and they began to mock him. And you remember earlier, the Jewish people had beaten Jesus and asked him to prophesy who had hit you. All of these mockery, all of these insulting things they had done to him. And when they had been satisfied with the mistreatment of Jesus and realizing that he was not going to answer them, Herod sent him back to Pilate. Pilate again appealed to the people. I have examined this man. I find nothing in my examination that would be worthy of his death. And they immediately began to cry, crucify him, which was one of the most horrible, horrible deaths that a person could die. That wasn't the only way they could put him to death, but they specified how they wanted this man to die, which speaks to the bitterness that they had toward Jesus at this time. And Pilate said, for what reason? There's nothing in him worthy of death. I have examined him. Herod examined him, and look, he sent him back to us. There's no charge worthy of death that has been substantiated. But then they said, you're not a friend of Caesar if you let this man live because he claims to be a king. Matthew is much more specific about the different things that went on here than is Luke. It was customary to release a prisoner to the Jews during the time of the Passover. And so they immediately asked for Barabbas to be released and Jesus to be crucified. Barabbas was not a nice person. This man had been charged with insurrection, which is one of the things they were trying to label Jesus with, was stirring up the people against the government. This man was charged with murder. And yet, the irony of this situation is that they asked that this man, who was already charged with insurrection and arrested by the Roman people and was accused of murder, to be released, and Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to be crucified. Pilate was a weak man. Whether he was afraid of his precarious situation or whatever reason, he was a weak man. And he yielded to the wishes of the people. And he turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. And they carried him out to Golgotha. You remember that Pilate had had Jesus scourged. I don't know if any of you, I'm sure some of you have seen the movie The Passion. While there are things in there that probably are not accurate according to the events, those scenes where Jesus was scourged by the Roman soldiers, it's just absolutely devastating to see what he went through. Many people died during this scourging, this whipping with whips. Jesus was very weak at this time. It was a requirement that he carry the crossbar, the cross, with him to the hill where he was going to be crucified. But he couldn't do it. He was too weak. And so they got a stranger in town named Simon, and they compelled him to carry this cross. Paul in Romans speaks of Simon and his two sons, Rufus and Alexander. Many of the scholars, and I'm taking their word for it, think that this was the same Simon that carried the cross of Jesus, and these men were well known in the church at Rome. They led him out to the hill to be crucified, and a large number of the people, including his disciples, followed him. And some women were with him that wailed for him. And Jesus turned around to them. And he says, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, blessed are the barren women, and the women that never bore, and the breasts that were never nursed. Then they will say, in the mountains fall down on us, and the hills cover us. For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Jesus had earlier predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the terrible things that were going to happen. The religious leaders and the people by and large in this capital city, the authorities had rejected him. They had killed the prophets, and it was time for judgment. And that's what he's looking at. And it was a horrible, horrible time. Josephus speaks very vividly about what went on there. This is what Jesus is looking at when he's talking to these women. There were two men who were criminals that were executed with Jesus, were crucified with him, one on either side of him. And the religious leaders, as he was hanging on the cross, began to sneer at him and say, he saved other people, but himself he cannot save. If you're the Christ, come down off the cross. One jeer after another. You remember that this was a very, very humiliating thing to happen to a human being. They stripped him and they nailed him to a cross. And there were the women out there who had followed him, who had supported him, his mother, people that he had healed. And they were seeing what was happening to them. These were not people that were just spectators. They knew who he was. They believed. And yet he was being crucified. One of the men who was being crucified with him railed out at him and said, hey, if you're the Christ, why don't you come down and save yourself and us too? But the other man said, don't you have any regard for God? Don't you fear God? We are on this cross because of the deeds we have done. This man has done nothing to deserve this punishment and this death. And he looked at Jesus and he said, Lord, remember me when you come in your kingdom. The faith of this man, to me, is amazing. What that says to me is that the teaching of Jesus was so pervasive that this thief that was dying with him knew about it and knew who he was and was asking for mercy. And Jesus said, today you will be with me in paradise. Darkness came upon the earth from the 6th to the 9th hour. 3 hours it was dark. The sun didn't shine. The 4-inch thick curtain in the temple between the holy place and the most holy place was ripped wide open. There was an earthquake. Strange things were going on. The tearing of that temple veil or curtain was highly symbolic, because by what Christ was suffering and doing here, he was opening the way of the most holy so that men could approach their God and not have to go through an intermediary priest. And the centurion who was in charge of the soldiers who were crucifying him saw all of these things. And Luke says, he said to himself, surely this was a just man. Matthew records that he said, surely this was a son of God. and he realized that they were putting to death a righteous man. There was a man named Joseph who had a tomb, and as soon as Jesus raised his voice and said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," he breathed his last. He was dead. Of course, the soldiers came and made sure he was dead. They had to break the legs of the two other men so that they couldn't raise up and get oxygen, and so they suffocated. Because the Jews wanted these people off the cross before eating the feast of the Passover. They didn't want this abomination or this disgrace to be available for people to see during the Passover. Ironical, their attitude about this. Normally, the Romans would let people hang on that cross maybe for days. But Joseph, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who had not consented in the judgment of the Sanhedrin on Jesus to be crucified, went to Pilate and he asked for Jesus' body. This was quite an act, because here was a member of the Sanhedrin, a member of the group that had demanded that Jesus be crucified, that was so bitter against Jesus, and he was associating with him by asking for his body. And he took the body and he wrapped it and he placed it in a tomb in a garden that was hewn out of a rock. No one had been laid in that tomb up until that point. It should move us when we review what happened to our Lord, to the Son of God. And in a few minutes, we're going to take the Lord's Supper. And the purpose of that is to share with one another and before our God the reliving in our minds of these events so that we not forget. So that we not forget. We remember. We relive these events in our minds so that it is before us throughout our Christian walk. You remember, and I've said this before, one of the laments that God had in response to sending his prophets is, I led these people out of bondage in Egypt. I worked all kinds of miracles to preserve them and save them from slavery. I put them in a land of milk and honey, and they have forgotten me. We won't forget Jesus Christ. We can't forget Jesus Christ and what he did, because every week we take the covenant of his blood and the fruit of the vine, the grape juice, and we take a bit of bread and remember that it was a body, a human body that was sacrificed. And so we remember. And it's important that we remember. I appreciate your kind attention. I believe my time is up. Thank you.